Hello and welcome to yet another virtual event with Tattered Cover Bookstore here in Denver, Colorado. My name is Adam and I am the director of events, and I am so excited about tonight's guest who will be talking about her latest book that is sure to be a bestseller. Before we get there, I just want to say, if you need closed captioning or want it, the little black bar at the bottom of your YouTube screen, there's a button that says CC. You can click that and get closed captioning. If you're interested in buying the book for tonight, I put a link in the YouTube chat already. You can just click that and buy that book right there. Super easy. I also want to point out, if you have any questions, please put them in the YouTube chat and I will come back on after the presentation and I will make sure we get those questions to tonight's author. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce the author of Nothing to Lose, the 25th book in the J.P. Beaumont series. I'm, of course, talking about J.A. Jance. She is the New York Times bestselling author, more than 60 books. She was born in South Dakota and raised in Bisbee, Arizona, and she currently lives with her husband in the Seattle area with two long-haired dachshunds, Mary and Jojo. J.A. Jance, please welcome to this virtual event. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fine. Last night I actually got to do a live virtual event, no, live event as opposed to a virtual one, in a room full of fans who were delighted to see me. I was delighted to see them. They were all masked. I was not masked. And when I do signings, I don't have people write down the names on Post-its, because the idea of a signing is to be able to meet the person who's signing the book. And if they just have a Post-it, they'll shove the book in front of me and no words will be exchanged. So usually I ask that Post-its not be supplied. But by the third customer last night, I discovered that with masks, I couldn't hear the names. And so I had to renege on that. But it was so wonderful to be with a live audience and to hear people laughing and to see people enjoying themselves. I've really missed that while I've been home working.
Yes. Well, we can't wait to get you in Denver in person eventually. But for tonight, thank you for doing a virtual event with us for Nothing to Lose. I will shut my camera off and let you just talk about this amazing book, and then I'll come back with audience questions in about 20 minutes.
Fair enough. In the fall of 1982, I began work on what was going to be a book about a Seattle detective. So I gave this guy a name, Beaumont. Actually, he's named after a friend of mine. When I was in Phoenix living through some really tough years just before I divorced my first husband, I was in a world of hurt. And I had this wonderful friend from Texas, Estelle DuBose. And I went to see her one night and I told her, she said, "Why, Judy, how are you doing?" And I said, "It's awful. I can't sleep. I can't eat. Things are so bad, I can't even pray about it." And she said, "Well, I'll tell you what. You pray to get through what you have to do for each day, and I will pray for the important stuff. I will pray to see you in your perfect place." Boy, did Estelle ever do a good job of praying, because here I am in my perfect place, doing a job I love, doing the job I always wanted to do. But at the time we had that conversation, the idea of my being a writer was so far on the back burner, I had almost forgotten that dream. Anyway, Estelle was born and raised in Beaumont, Texas. So I named Beaumont after the town and after her. I lost Estelle just a few weeks ago, but it's wonderful to be able to let my readers know the real origin of Beau's name. So I gave this detective a name, I gave him a job, I gave him a place to live, and then I sat back to see what he was going to do. And the problem is he wouldn't do anything. He was dead in the water. I could not get that book to come to order. So by March of the following year, after being stalled out for 6 months, I sent my kids to a local camp for spring break, to Camp Orkala. And then I got on the train here in Seattle to go to Portland and spend 5 days with a friend of mine from my days in the insurance business. I got on the train with a stack of blue line notebooks and a fistful of ballpoint pens. And as the train pulled out of the King Street station, I thought, what would happen if I wrote this book through the detective's point of view? So I got out a notebook, I got out a pen, and I started to write. And I wrote these words. She might have been a cute kid once. That was hard to tell now. She was dead. Whoa. And it was as though lightning had struck, because with those few words, there I was on the back side of Seattle's Magnolia Bluff. I was walking around a crime scene in J.P. Beaumont's shoes. I was hearing what he said, hearing what other people said to him, but I was also hearing what was going on in his head. And I was seeing everything he saw. From that moment in March of 1983, J.P. Beaumont and I have been character and author. So 2022 is actually the 40th anniversary of my meeting him. I've actually been with him longer than I've been with my second husband, and we're going on 37 years. But that was when I met him. And I know when I tell people I met him on a train, that sounds sort of Agatha Christie-ish. And actually, Agatha Christie is a hero of mine. No surprises there. But that's the origin of this whole thing. And when I wrote that book, I thought I was writing a standalone book. I thought I was writing a book. When Avon Books bought the manuscript as the first book in a series, I was really surprised. And the idea back in 1983 that this many years later I would be publishing J.P. Beaumont number 25 was entirely out of the question. By the way, Beaumont is kind of a sneaky guy. He manages to get into places where I don't really expect him to turn up. He's been in 2 separate Joanna Brady books, Partner in Crime and Fire and Ice. He snuck his way into a Walker family book, Dance of the Bones. And now, and he also made it into the most recent Alley book, Unfinished Business. So I can't quite get the guy to stay in his place. When I write books, some characters are one-book characters. Some characters that I think are one-book characters end up being multi-book characters. But if there are characters I wonder about later, if I say, well, whatever happened to those people? The only way for me to figure out what really happened to them is for me to write another book. And that's what happened in the case of Nothing to Lose. I spent 5 years as a K through 12 librarian on the Tohono O'odham Reservation west of Tucson. And some of the stories I told were the stories we all grew up with: The Little Engine That Could, Rapunzel, Cinderella, Make Way for Ducklings, all of those stories and books. But I also learned and told the stories of the desert people, the Tohono O'odham people. And one of the principles of Tohono O'odham storytelling is that a story must end where it begins. And I finally realized that I took that piece of storytelling structure, and it's been part of many, many of my books. In the last Alley book, for instance, that book starts in the Monroe Correctional Facility here in Washington State. It starts in the Monroe Correctional Facility. It ends in the Monroe Correctional Facility. In this book, I wanted to know what happened to Sue Danielson's boys. In Beaumont number 14, a book called Breach of Duty, Beau is still working for Seattle PD as a homicide cop, and he is partnered with a single mom named Sue Danielson. Sue Danielson's ex-husband is a really troubled guy, an abusive, troubled guy. And so Sue has gotten a divorce and is making her way in life. And then the ex-husband reinserts himself in their lives. So Beau has worked with her for years. He knows her sons, Jared and Christopher. And when the ex-husband comes to town and there is a terrible fight brewing, the older boy, Jared, calls Beau and says, "What should we do?" And Beaumont says, "Take your brother, go out through the window, get out of the house, hide down under the troll, and I'll come get you. But get out of the house now." In that situation, he was afraid that having cop cars descend on the home would make matters worse. And he thought having one officer arrive, namely him, would be better. When he gets there, he goes inside, and it's already too late. Sue Danielson is propped against the living room wall, shot and bleeding out. And so, through all the years since, Beau has, that was a landmark moment in his life, a watershed moment. Sue Danielson's death was the reason he left Seattle PD and started working someplace else. But he has sort of PTSD about it. That nightmare scene comes back to him over and over when he's sleeping, and it has done so through all these years. So now life has changed for him. He's retired. He's married to his third wife, Mel Soames. She is the chief of police in Bellingham, Washington. And they're living this settled life, and Beau is trying to figure out how to be a house husband. He's not very good at it. So he's sort of unhappily retired. And as this book starts, he awakens. It's the dead of winter, and Mel is up and getting ready for work. He doesn't have to go to work so early. So when she calls to him and says, "Babe, the shower isn't draining," this is bad news for the house husband. A shower that is not draining. It's not like those America's Funniest Videos where the kids say, "Dad, there's water coming out of the bathroom," and he goes upstairs and there's a little line of water bottles coming out of the bathroom. No, this is a lot more serious. So he hustles out of bed. He takes their new dog, Sarah, outside to do her outside doggy duty. And then he begins dealing with the sewage backup, which, as it turns out, is all his fault. Because the dog, their new dog, Sarah, is an Irish wolfhound rescued from a puppy mill in Palm Springs, California. Suddenly she's living in Bellingham, Washington, where it snows, and she doesn't like snow, and she doesn't like to get her big her big paws cold and snowy. And so given the opportunity to not go out in the yard, she would rather do her duty on the porch. And so both kind of her opinion when it comes to going out in the snow. So when he finds a little, well, Irish Wolfhound doo-doo is not little ever, sitting on the porch, he presses the easy button and flushes it. Turns out, flushing frozen Irish Wolfhound #2 down an indoor toilet is a very bad idea. Now, you may be sitting there wondering, well, where is this coming from? And I have to tell you, I write fiction, but I'm lazy. I don't always make things up. And years ago, I just happened to have an Irish Wolfhound who didn't like to go outside in the cold. And so this is a piece of J.A. Jance history woven into the background of the book. And I put it in because it was fun. And, you know, it doesn't have anything to do with the plot, but it has to do with me. And I like to put little pieces of me into the background of the stories. So once Bo handles the plumbing problem, there's a knock on the door, and he goes to answer it. And here's this young man in priestly attire. And his first thought is, because I can still hear his thoughts, you know, is the Catholic Church hitting the skids and they have to send people out, sort of like Watchtower, going door to door. But then the guy introduces himself, and it turns out he's Jared Danielson, now Father Danielson, Sue Danielson's older son, come to ask him for help because his younger brother, Chris, is now missing, and he wants Bo to help him find him. Someone said, well, why did you set this book in Alaska? Do you have connections to Alaska? No. I've been there on cruises 4 times, counting the Disney cruise. I've been there once for a book conference, once on a book tour. So I've been there 5 times in total, always in the summer, never in the dead of winter. So why did I set it in Alaska? Well, that's where those characters were from all those years ago. And when I wrote Breach of Duty, and I had no idea that years later I would write another book and have to go back and pull all those strings of story together into a new spot. I have some really favorite characters in this book. My husband Bill is sort of a gearhead, and I write murder mysteries, so I watch a lot of true crime on TV because for someone who's never been in law enforcement, it's a way of keeping up with genetics, with forensics. It's a way of finding out what's going on in law enforcement. It's a way of seeing how cops actually deal with suspects and family members. So I watch a lot of that. Bill, on the other hand, watches a lot of home and garden TV and Motor Trend. So over the years, we watch TV together, and so he ends up watching more blood and guts TV than he would like, and the reverse is also true. But I really enjoyed Wheeler Dealers. And a year or so ago, Wheeler Dealers, what they do is they take some old kind of iconic car and recreate it and put it back together and sell it, hopefully for a profit. And one of the cars they chose was an International Harvester. Well, I looked at that International Harvester from the 50s, and I didn't have any idea that an International Harvester ever made anything other than tractors. So here they created this Travelall, an International Harvester Travelall, which was actually the precursor to all the SUVs that are everywhere you see on the road today. And I watched them put that together, complete with a gigantic luggage rack on the top. And when I met this character in the book, Bo is up there, the weather is awful. None of the Uber drivers are willing to go out into this awful weather. And so somebody said, well, you could try TW transportation. And he says, what's that? Well, it turns out TW transportation belongs to a lady named Twinkle Winkleman. And as soon as I met Twinkle Winkleman, AKA Twink, I just loved her. And she sort of reminds me of that old Johnny Cash song of A Boy Named Sue. Her father saddled her with the name Twinkle Winkleman, and she's been sort of mad about it ever since. But the moment she appeared in my imagination, I knew that she needed to drive an International Harvester Travelall complete with a luggage rack. The other favorite character in the book is Harriet Rains. She is the keeper of human remains found in various places around Alaska. And she's this wonderful person she's part indigenous, part not indigenous, and she brings a whole other layer of interesting stuff to the story. But in this book, you won't find the story beginning and ending in exactly the same place. It doesn't begin and end with a plumbing issue. What it does begin and end with is Bo reliving that nightmare of Sue Danielson's death. I'm wondering if my host could come back on. Are there any questions? I'm not sure how much time I have. I'm not used to. I need to know if I can talk more about other stuff or if I'm sort of done.
Yeah, I mean, we have some questions. We can answer some questions, and you can talk a little bit more. We're flexible. It's hard when you don't have an audience like smiling back at you. I'll ask some audience questions. Cindy asks, how do you bring your characters to life? Like, what's your tip? What's your secret to making all these characters feel so real?
I spent 18 years of my life with a man who died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. Now, I wasn't allowed in the creative writing program at the University of Arizona in 1964 because, as the professor told me, you're a girl. He was absolutely right. I was a girl. And so when I sat down to create Beaumont in 1982, I wrote that book in the first person. He was a cop, but he couldn't work all the time. He had to do something else when he wasn't working. And I hadn't been in a writing program where they told me you need to write what you know, but I was sort of smart enough to figure that out. And it turns out I knew a lot about drinking. So I had Bo do the kind of drinking I had lived with for all those years. Well, the thing about the drinking I had lived with is it was really problematic drinking. And so I was in Portland signing at a little B. Dalton's in a mall, sitting outside in the mall corridor with my books on the table. And it was the fourth book, Taking the Fifth. I should have named the fifth book Taking the Fifth, but that's water under the bridge. I missed that boat. Anyway, a lady came up to the table and she said, Bo drinks every day. He has a drink of choice. and it is starting to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem? And I said, these are books. But in the course of that set of signings, 6 other people asked me the same question. And the reason Beau's drinking seems so real is that it was real. It was part of my real experience. But here's the magic part about it. I didn't notice. That
Mhm.
went into the books in a way that was totally invisible to me on a conscious level. I think I think in a way the creative part of you, or at least the creative part of me, understands things about my own life that the conscious part of me misses. um, that that turned out to be true with Joanna Brady's history. My first husband died at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him, and so I became the last parent standing in our family. And what I learned about being the last parent is the person that's dead gets a free pass, and the person that's left, being the parent and telling the kids what they have to do and what they can't do. You have to do the dishes, you can't have the car keys, blah, blah, blah. That person becomes evil incarnate. So on the very first page of the very first Joanna Brady book, we meet Joanna Brady and her mother. And she and her mother have been at odds forever. And it took me years to figure out that not only was Joanna Brady's mother, Eleanor Lathrop, the last parent standing in her family, within a matter of pages of that first book, Joanna Brady is also the last parent standing in her family. And that dynamic, that conflict between Eleanor and Joanna is threads its way through all of the books. And and yet I didn't know it was so important when I wrote that first page. So I can't explain exactly how I do it. It's sort of like, according to physics, bumblebees aren't supposed to be able to fly, but they do because they never listened to anybody who said they couldn't. And that's sort of the answer to how I create the books. But I let those pieces of myself leak into the books, and I think that lends them some real validity.
Yeah. And then Donald has a question. You mentioned how Beau has seeped into other places you didn't expect him to be. Are there any characters from this series, from Beau's series, who surprised you? Like you created them and then they became something else?
Well, yes, Twinkle Winkleman surprised me because I thought he hired her to drive him around Anchorage the first day he was in town, and the next thing you know, she's driving him to Homer, 4 hours away. And I thought, okay, she'll just go home and mind her own business. But she stayed on for the whole book and was there for the crashing climax. And so, yes, characters surprise me all the time.
Mhm. Do you have a favorite character other than Beau from the series throughout the years?
Well, I've written over 60 books.
Mhm.
And one of the things that keeps me fresh is I'm not always writing about the same set of characters. I could never have been Sue Grafton. I could not have set out planning on writing that many books about one character without slitting my own throat. I have a limited attention span. And so by being able to write about the Walkers are set on the reservation, the Ellie Reynolds books are mostly around Sedona, the Joanna Brady books are mostly in southeastern Arizona, and the Beau books are mostly in the Seattle area. And so that means that with each series, I have a separate cast of characters, and I have a different locale. With Joanna Brady, we meet her when her daughter Jenny is 9 years old. And now, 18 books later, she's a sophomore in college. So by writing a series, I've been able to watch these people grow and change over the years. Beaumont has grown and changed over the years. Uh, After that reader in Portland pointed out the problem, I thought, well, Beau's a smart guy. Maybe he will do something about his drinking. So in book number 7, he went to a wedding, ended up losing his car, hurt his fingers, couldn't figure out what happened to his fingers. And so that was his first unavoidable blackout. He'd had blackouts before, but he was able to fudge because nobody noticed. Well, this time everybody noticed. So that's book 7. He has the blackout. In book number 8, he's in treatment. This is book number 25. So he's been sober a lot longer than he wasn't. I still have people who tell me they liked him better when he was drunk. I worry about those folks. But a few years ago, I went back to write another book. I was curious about somebody else from the earlier series, and I was curious about Jasmine Day, a singer who turned up in Seattle in book number 4, and Beau and Jasmine had a one-night stand. And so when I knew I was going to be writing a book to see what happened to her, I went back and read that book, and I was really shocked because Beau had changed so much over the years. But this book was early on when he was still drinking and carousing and living the wild and woolly life. So when Sins of the Father starts, he's in Bellingham, minding his own business. There's a knock on the door. And here's a guy standing on his doorstep, holding an infant seat with an infant in it. And it turns out that infant is his granddaughter. Athena is the daughter of the daughter J.P. Beaumont never knew he had. And so, once again, going back and finding out what became of those earlier characters sent me off writing a whole new book.
Yeah. And we have another question. You mentioned Joanna Brady. Sherry asked, what was the impetus for getting JP connected to Joanna Brady?
What was the reason for doing that?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, at that point, my editor called me. We were actually in Palm Springs for Christmas, and she called me. People had asked me if Beau and Joanna were ever going to meet, and I said, in order to write that book, I would have to be able to believe it could happen. Mm. And so they're not ever going to meet. Well, then Cochise County built a new justice center in Bisbee. And that included building a new jail. And they took the low bidder. And the low bidder built a jail with drop ceilings. So guess what? One day, 4 guys broke out of the Cochise County Jail. They walked up the road 1.5 miles to a neighborhood called Saginaw. They broke into a house. They murdered a man and a woman, an old couple. They stole their goods, their pickup truck, and took off. One of them was found a day later in New Mexico. Another one turned up in Texas. The third one was caught in Florida. Guess where number 4 was? Tacoma, Washington, just down the street from here. And suddenly I could see that it was possible for a detective in Seattle to have a connection to someone in Cochise County. So then my editor called and said, Judy, you have two sets of fans. You have the Beaumont fans and you have the Brady fans. Could you write a book that would get both sets of fans reading the same book at the same time? And that was the reason to write Partner in Crime. And it worked because now people read J.A. Jance books. They don't necessarily just stick to one or the other. They have preferences. Some prefer one book, some prefer another book. A lady last night said she was buying the Beaumont book, but she really likes Joanna better. And I told her what Estelle told me. Honey, thank God we're not all alike. Otherwise, we'd all be married to the same man and drive a Mustang.
That's terrific. Yeah, so many great characters. And the people are just commenting on just how much they love the different characters. Someone talked about how, going back to when you were talking about the wolfhound size piles of dog poo, that's just a reason they love you so much. A question, a few questions that are similar, so I'll kind of combine them. Where do you get your ideas for like the crimes now? I mean, 25 in for just this one character. Oh, I mean, is it easy? Is it hard? How do they come about?
I go shopping in my head. I don't use real cases. My first husband and I were connected to a serial killer case in Tucson in the 1970s. We were teaching on the reservation. I had to stay late after work. He hitchhiked home to our house, which was 30 miles from town in either direction, 2 miles off the highway, 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and/or telephone. And he hitchhiked home because we were going to have company and somebody needed to be there to let the company in through the gate. So I came home and we climbed in the car and we were driving into Tucson for dinner. We got stopped at a roadblock and we said to the officer, "What's going on?" Oh, he said, "There's been a homicide on the reservation." We said, "Really? Anglo or Indian?" He said, "Anglo." We said, "Good, it's nobody we know then." So we went to the trading post to get gas, and while my husband was filling the tank, I went in to pay, and I overheard a deputy talking to the clerk, and he said something about a man in a green car and something about two little kids. So when I got back out to the car, I reported this conversation, and a few miles down the road, my husband said, "A man in a green car, I wonder if he's the guy who gave me a ride home today." So we went back to the trading post. We told him who we were and where we lived. And at 6 o'clock the next morning, Jack Lyons, who was Pima County's chief homicide detective, was at our house. He interviewed my husband from 6 o'clock in the morning until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. It's the only actual homicide interview I've ever seen. And I internalized that whole thing. The way he asked the questions elicited information that turned out to be clues the cops were able to use to identify the guy and take him into custody. They had him do a composite. The woman who was murdered was 28 years old. She was on her way to Rocky Point for the weekend with her two children in the back seat, a 2-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy. And she was forced off the highway 10 miles west of Sells, shot, raped in front of her two children, and left to die. An hour and a half later, this was on the 22nd of May, an hour and a half later, some Indians coming home from working at the Hecla mine saw these two little Anglo kids walking along the road. And they said, "What are you doing?" The little boy said, "We're walking on the beach." And they said, "Where's your mommy?" And he said, "She's over there. She's dead." Well, she wasn't dead then, but she never made it to the hospital. When my husband did a composite of the guy who drove him home, the little boy said, "That's the man who killed my mommy." So That was on the 22nd of May. With the information my husband provided, within a matter of days, Jack Lyons had pretty well identified the suspect. However, he also figured out that he was a serial killer. He murdered people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. Uh, and he shot them off moving vehicles. He shot a 16-year-old girl off a bicycle. He shot a 40-something-year-old man off a bulldozer, and then the woman on her way to Rocky Point. On, by the way, I stayed on the hill by myself. They, he wanted, what Jack Lyons was trying to do was have all his ducks in a row before he actually took the guy into custody. But he was worried because the incidents were getting closer together. He advised us to leave the hill and come and live someplace else, but we were young and stupid. I said, no, I'm not leaving. So for 40 of the next 60 days, I was on the hill by myself. My husband was out of town working construction. I wore a loaded weapon on my hip. I was fully prepared to use it. And I actually did fire it one morning. I fired all 6 shots at a rapidly retreating rattlesnake who was still laughing when it went up over the wall and disappeared. But I figured if the killer showed up, he would present a larger target, and I was motivated. Well, by the 20th of July, Jack was worried that the 22nd was coming. So he took my husband with him to San Manuel. My husband identified the guy as he came off shift. So he rode it in the vehicle with Jack and the suspect back into Tucson. And on the way, the suspect admitted to having been to our house on 3 separate occasions in the intervening 60 days. So, years passed. I didn't, the first book I ever wrote was 1,400 pages long, and it never sold to anybody because it was 1,400 pages long. But it was a thinly fictionalized version of that real case. And in writing 1,400 pages, I essentially wrote 3 complete novels. And that was my on-the-job training as a writer. I never sold that book, but I had to write that book to learn how to write. After I wrote 9 Beaumont books and was tired of him and was thinking of knocking him off, my editor said, well, you remember that book nobody ever bought. Why don't you rework that one and we'll make that be your first hardback. Well, the real killer was still in prison. He did a plea bargain. He's still in prison in Arizona to this day. But back then they were thinking about letting him out. And I didn't want to write a book that would cause his attention to come to me. So when they asked me to rework that book, I didn't redo that book. I created a new story altogether. But I took what I had learned in the course of that investigation and put that into the book. By the way, in that book, it's Hour of the Hunter, the first Walker family book. The main protagonist, Diana Ladd, is a woman who's a teacher on the reservation. She really wants to be a writer. Her husband was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. He's dead at the beginning of the book. And the crazed killer turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. So that was my first real case of writerly revenge.
Mhm.
It came out in 1990. Decades pass. And suddenly, it's 2001. And in April, I'm in Pine Top, Arizona, doing a presentation in a library. And library presentations are kind of, the author is a target, particularly when you're seated at the signing table. If there's a nutcase in the room, and there's usually at least one, that nutcase is going to wait until the very end of the line to be there to monopolize the author's time. They hardly ever want to write a book. My real education in that happened when I was doing a signing, and a guy came up to the table and said, "Are you the lady who writes the murder mysteries?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I've just been acquitted of murdering 7 people. Do you want to write my book?" "No, thank you. No, no, no. I do not want to write your book." So my situational awareness button is turned on high when I'm doing signings. So in Pine Top, in the very back of the room, there was a woman standing. She stood there with her arms crossed. She never smiled. She never laughed at any of the books, any of the jokes. She wasn't there with a friend. She was there by herself. And I thought, she's the one who's going to be the problem. Sure enough, very end of the signing line, there she is. And she stepped up to me and she said, "Was your husband a witness in a series of homicides that took place in Tucson in 1970? And I said, "Yes, he was." And with no further introduction, as though we had been having that conversation for the past 30 years, she said, "My father was the man on the bulldozer. My mother was pregnant with me when that happened. She would never talk to me about it. What can you tell me?" And I was so grateful that the first book I wrote was never published, because what I learned is real homicides affect real people. And I don't want to take someone else's tragedy and turn that into entertainment. Very long answer to a question, sorry.
Oh, great. I mean, an important answer. We have time for one last question. We'll keep it simple. You have Beaumont, Brady, Reynolds. What's the next book coming out after this? Because it seems like there's always one coming.
Well, I'm working on the next Alley book right now, and I have to tell you, it's been really challenging to write. It was due in September, and it's not there. I'm down to the last 2 chapters now. It's almost finished. But when, obviously, since I didn't deliver it on time, during the pandemic, I've written 3 books and published 3 books. And so this is the fourth one. And I think that the oppression of being on lockdown and being on short boundaries and being flooded day after day with nothing but bad news, I think that really got in the way of my creative process. And so when it was clear that they would have to move the pub date for that book, they sent the notice to Amazon, and Amazon's algorithm decided that Collateral Damage, the next Alley Reynolds book, will be published December 1 of 2043. So it's late, but it's not that late. I may still be alive and writing by 2043, but I wouldn't count on it. So I don't know when that book will be coming out, but the book is finally gelling, and it has been really challenging, but I think it will also be engaging.
Well, I am very excited to see it. I am so excited that Nothing to Lose is out. Thank you for doing a virtual event. I know you'd rather be in person. We'll get you to Denver eventually. But thank you for being here and talking to everyone over Zoom/YouTube.
Thank you. I've been happy to do it.
Yes, and have safe travels. And thank you for everyone who joined us tonight.
Thank you. Good night.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We're not live anymore. I just want to say thank you